Hello, everybody. It is Monday, January the 20th, 2025. A momentous day, at least, in the mind of Donald Trump and his supporters. According to him, in his presidential inaugural address today, he promised a new golden age for the United States. Lots of excitement. He claims that American decline, whatever that means, is over. And in the speech, he mentioned America, I think, more than any other word. There will be of course, some skepticism on this. My guest today on the show, Robert Kaplan, made an interview in November of last year in Australia, where he suggested that the election of Trump would accelerate the fall of the United States. Robert Kaplan, a very distinguished writer, traveler, has a new book out next week, Wasteland, A World in Permanent Crisis. And he's joining us from his home in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Robert, congratulations on the new book. Did you watch Trump's address?
Yes, first of all, thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here. I did watch Trump's address. And the thing that struck me the most was nothing he said. It was the people in the room. You had all the moguls of Silicon Valley, hundreds of billions of dollars worth, right, literally, within a few feet of him. And, it's empires, great powers tend to go into decline when there's the money culture, when there's a confluence of money and power that goes on for very long, and it leads to decadence. And I think this is what I saw today. What are these people, Tim Cook, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos? They're worth so much money. They're so successful. Why do they need to get on their hands and knees to Trump?
Why do you think? You mentioned three of them, Cook, Musk, and Bezos. They're all quite different characters, and they all have quite different jobs or lack of jobs at the moment. I mean, Cook isn't quite as wealthy as
absolutely, because he actually runs a company. He's a CEO. But nevertheless, I think it's because they have this fear that if they're not nice to the new president, or not perceived to be nice to the new president, their companies, their various enterprises will be hurt. There's always good reasons for this, but if you read Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, other books, and if you read Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, which I highlight in my new book, Wasteland, you see how one of the aspects of a civilization in decline is when it gets taken over by what he calls the money culture.
Robert, you use the D word, decadence. What does that word mean, and why is it so important, at least in your critique, not just of the US, but the world more broadly today?
Yeah, because I bring in Spengler, Ibn Khaldun, other philosophers and historians, and one of the things that all of them highlight is that civilizations and great powers grow up, they mature, they become the D word, decadent, and then they decline. And the age of empire is often an age of decadence and decline, because it reaches the highest point of civilization, where the ultimate advantage, the ultimate thing to have is style. And we see this all over our culture in many ways. It's not a bad thing. It shows the vibrancy of our culture, but it also, when you look at it in a deep historical pattern, is a sign of the beginning of decline.
You use the V word as well, vibrancy. The great Anglo-American journalist Alistair Cook, in his book about America, I think it came out in 1971 or 1972, height of Watergate, suggested that great powers, and particularly the United States, went through these cycles of decadence and vitality. Is the opposite, Robert, of decadence a word like vitality? Can you be
It could
decadent
be.
and vibrant at the same time? Or what's the
Yeah.
opposite of decadence?
Yeah, it could be. And let me say at the beginning that I think, and I've written in this new book, that decline itself can be overrated. Decline goes on for decades upon decades, and it only has meaning when compared to the decline or rise of other great powers. So the United States may be in decline, but it may be so slow and gradual, and China and Russia's decline are faster, that America seems to grow, seems to gain an advantage even as it is in decline. I think Alistair Cook, wrote his book over 50 years ago, and one of the themes of Wasteland is that globalization, rather than suck all of America into the globalized world, has essentially split American society in two, into a globalized half, very sophisticated, European vacation oriented wine sipping half, and then the other half, which for various reasons cannot compete, are left, are stuck in the old nation state, in the flyover states of the Trumpian interior, where the globalized half would rather not go. So in this sense, and this has its effect in politics, you have, the center is gone, and you have a Democratic Party that's moved increasingly to the left with its media organs, and a Republican Party that's moved increasingly to the populist right with its media organs, so that elections become about survival itself, which they never used to be.
What about ontology, information, truth, Robert, in your wasteland world, a world in permanent crisis? We've heard for years from Trump that America is in the worst state it's ever been in its history. It's in absolute permanent decline. And in a single day now, he's talking about a golden age and the decline is over. We know that he's a brilliant manipulator of reality. Lots of books, you've read, I'm sure, many of them, about the ontological crisis of truth these days. How does this fit in to your thesis of a wasteland?
Well, the book is divided into three parts. The first is about Weimar Germany and how the world today is like Weimar Germany. It's called Weimar Goes Global. The second part is called The Great Powers in Decline, meaning the United States, China, and Russia. And the third part, the part you're referring to, Andrew, is called Crowds and Chaos. And it's about the growth of cities, and how with the internet, the whole world is a city. And how we used to have a America was a great country in the old oil and gas superhighway print and typewriter age. And in the print and typewriter age, truth was easier to establish because you had long essays professionally written that were fact-checked, and you had therefore a much more skeptical and a much more nuanced public with a political center in both parties. Now, you cannot imagine someone like President Donald Trump outside of the digital video era, which has replaced the print and typewriter age. And the digital video era is, it's given not to moderation, but to bouts of passion, to explosions of inarticulate passion via social media. And that has had its effect on the two major parties, which has driven each of them to an extreme. And again, mass democracy functions best in the center, when there's a center. And that is what is increasingly dissolving.
You mentioned that the first section of the book was on Weimar. Of course, when we hear Weimar, we think of cabaret and all that noise, all the glamour. Maybe in some ways it's similar. Last week, I had my old friend Ece Temelkuran, the Turkish exile writer, on the show, who talked about something called the new fascism. Lots of people suggest that that the world of Donald Trump and other autocrats is fascistic. What's your take, Robert? What can we learn about Weimar, about this slide into autocracy?
Yes, well, Weimar ended with Hitler, and I say early on in the book that that is not the destiny of the world. The world is too big, too varied. It's not going to end in some totalitarian apocalypse or something like that. But Weimar, as you pointed out, Andrew, is about two things. It was about ultimate lack of political order. The monarchy was gone, and there was always a fight for control, and it was one long crisis after the other. But the arts bloomed in Weimar. It wasn't just cabaret; it was the Bauhaus architecture. It was the poetry of Rainier, Marie Rilke, and a whole bunch of others. So Weimar could have had a positive ending. It didn't have to end with Hitler. And I go into the details of how, everything is contingent. It's not all fate. I'm not sure that I would call President Trump, a proto-fascist. I don't think he's serious enough for that. Serious enough to have a really thought out program. He's not a reader. His attention span goes from one thing to the other. He wanted to get out of Afghanistan fast in his first term, and then he essentially lost interest and didn't staff it through the bureaucracy. So it never happened under his term. I'm not sure that he's determined enough with a specific program to be a proto-fascist, but he's certainly one thing about fascism, though, that I go into in the book is that it's the bully's culture. It's about ultra masculinity. It's about the culture of the trenches, essentially, during World War I. Trump has some of that, but I'm not convinced that he's a fascist.
Maybe perhaps Mussolini was a better model for that. You've mentioned Spengler, a very controversial figure, whose most famous book is The Decline of the West. You make that in some ways a central theme in the book. Is your interpretation of Spengler, a cyclical theorist as opposed to a linear one? Does he suggest that world history goes from a period perhaps of vitality to decadence, round and round from one empire to the next?
He's cyclical in the sense that he thinks that civilizations, empires, as I said earlier, grow up, mature, become decadent, and then dissolve and are replaced by other empires. And that was not new, because Ibn Khaldun had basically the same theory in the 13th century. I think that Spengler is deeply conservative. He's very hard to like. But some of his perceptions are very interesting for the time in which we live. For instance, he talks about the folk and the mob. The folk are in the countryside and the mob is in the great cities. And both of them more or less deny the power of individual agency. It's all about the power of the crowd, essentially. And that's where Spengler is most interesting. The problem with Spengler is that his context is far too broad, as if to be inhuman. He feels that art started to decline in the late 19th century and kept getting worse and worse. He said that music started to decline in the mid 19th century and just got worse and worse. So he would deny a lot of the great art and music that we've associated in the course of our lives, because his time frame, is a matter of centuries and millennia.
Yeah, it doesn't look a lot of fun. German, I don't want to make too many jokes about German lack of humor, but I don't suppose he made many jokes, did he, Spengler?
Well, one thing I can tell you about him was that he was an iconoclast his whole life. He was never embraced by anyone in Germany. He started out lonely and misunderstood, and he ended up under the Nazis as lonely and misunderstood, and eventually died. I believe it was 1935. I can't remember exactly. But the Nazis thought that he might like them, but they were wrong. They were totally wrong on that. He considered the Nazis part of the decadent decline of the West.
Yeah, maybe the Italian, I mentioned Mussolini earlier, the Italian version of Spengler was Pareto and his theory of elites. Do you talk about Pareto at all? What's your...
No, I don't. Actually, I don't. I talk about a lot of people, and it's a short book, but not Pareto.
Of course, the title of the book, Wasteland, is taken from the poem of T.S. Eliot. How does Eliot feature in your narrative?
Well, the Wasteland, of course, it's hard to follow, hard to understand.
You mean the poem,
the poem itself. The critics have argued about its line-by-line meaning for 100 years. It affects one with abstract horror. And what it basically communicates is a sense of alienation, sort of like being in a country where a language is spoken and you don't understand it, and nobody understands you, essentially. He talks about, the fragmentation of society after the end of the Great War, and about cities being unreal and alienating. So I think in an atmospheric sense, the poem communicates what I'm trying to get across in the book. So I used it, I employed it in the title. But Eliot actually is a much more sympathetic figure, of course, than Spengler. I mean, The Wasteland you may not understand, but it's often beautiful to listen to. And some of his other poems of the period, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock and Gerontium, are also very beautiful. How, if in an alienating, pessimistic way. There is nothing beautiful about Spengler.
Some people are going to be watching this or listening, Robert, and thinking, Robert Kaplan borrows from Spengler and Solzhenitsyn and Jean Kirkpatrick in this new book about decline, a world in permanent crisis. He used to be a young guy, went to the Balkans, he became famous as a young traveler, and now he's got old and conservative and crusty. How would you respond to that kind of critique?
Well, I am a conservative in the old-fashioned sense. I'll admit to that. I'm a realist, but an internationalist, not an isolationist. And I think the only way we can learn is to read what's come before us and to reintroduce a new generation of readers, people who may have overlooked or who don't follow these writers, and to give it a kind of a new meaning. I think, you learn not just by going out in the field, but you also learn through reading. Because when you read a good book, you're really listening to a monologue by somebody who's incredibly articulate and wise in many cases.
You've been on the show before. You had a book last year, The Loom of Time Between Empire and Anarchy, from the Mediterranean to China. You've had a number of successful books, including the 1994 book, The Coming Anarchy, Shattering the Dreams of the Post-Cold War. It was also a viral success in the Atlantic. You used to write regularly for the Atlantic. How is your argument different in Wasteland from The Coming Anarchy? Is it the second volume of that book, or is it entirely different?
No, it's different. The Coming Anarchy was largely a work of reporting in West Africa, in Turkey, in other places. And it combined reporting with reading. And it was what the main theme of The Coming Anarchy was that the environment, the natural and physical environment, would be the national security issue of the 21st century. And this was published in 1994. So that was the theme. Another theme of that was about the transformation of war into criminal war. This is much broader, and it's not informed by on-the-ground reporting like The Coming Anarchy was.
One of the words that occurred to me when I was looking at your book is the concept of a polycrisis. I think it was invented by a French sociologist, Edgar Morin, in 1993. Is the Wasteland, this world in permanent crisis, is this the polycrisis that Morin and lots of other economists and analysts now refer to?
You could put it that way. I mean, that's a fair definition, but I think it's deeper, because it's not just a lot of crises happening at once. It's their increased integration through technology. And it happens at a time when all three great powers, in my opinion, are in gradual decline. Russia more steeply than China, and China more steeply than America. And that will not lead to a kind of BRICS paradise or something like that. It will lead to more confusion in the world.
One person, I think, who will have some issues with your thesis, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Kishore Mahbubani, Singapore-based analyst and writer. You probably crossed swords with him in the past. I don't think he would agree about China's decline. In fact, he sees I think his last book was called The Asian Century. He sees the 21st century as the Asian century. And I don't want to put words into Kishore's mouth. He certainly has many of his own words. But he might argue that your book is simply a reflection of American decline and a manifestation of that. How would you respond to critics like Mahbubani, who see the 21st century as the Asian and perhaps more specifically the Chinese century?
I see a lot of problems with China. I think that, the United States had a great relationship with China between the death of Mao and the rise of Xi Jinping. Under Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, you had a collegial, modest, moderate, quasi-capitalistic authoritarianism that people in Washington and the media and elsewhere could all live with. And I think under the Leninist autocracy of Xi Jinping, China's problems are mounting. And because China is such an autocracy, its problems are more hidden and obscured than those of the United States, which is a boisterous democracy. But I'm not sure I see an Asian century. I think what I see more, and I don't see a golden age for America as President Trump declared today. I see more of a time when all three great powers will be facing increasing difficulties, and there is nobody on the horizon to replace them.
Robert, I was in Europe last week, just back. I think some Europeans would be depressed with the fact you haven't even mentioned Europe yet. You've talked about three great powers in decline. How does perhaps the uber decline of Europe, the EU, the situation in the UK, how does that fit into your narrative?
Well, I think Europe is in the fight zone. On the one hand, you have the war in Ukraine to the east of Europe, which has been getting a lot of attention, rightly so. And on the other hand, you have what's been getting less attention is in the last few years, at least, is the gradual migration and immigration of people from the relatively higher birth rate societies of sub-Saharan Africa and to the troubled violence of the violent prone greater Middle East. So Europe is where it is. Ukraine isn't its only problem. It's going to, over the course of the remainder of the 21st century, there are going to be 7 Africans for every European. Now, those Africans may be middle class, they may be educated. Nevertheless, it's going to be very, very difficult for Europe to integrate new people in a world where so many people are on the move.
You mentioned the Ukraine. You gave an interesting interview about whether or not we in the West, do we really want the Ukraine to win the war? What's your take on the current situation? When I was in Europe, I had an interesting conversation with quite a senior German diplomat who now works at the EU, who believes that there now is the conditions for a peace in 2025. What's your take, and what should we want to happen?
Well, what I'd like to happen is that there would be an armistice or a truce in which President Putin does not seem to be the victor, where it becomes clear that, invading Ukraine was a mistake. I think it would be very dangerous to have an armed truce in which Putin is seen to be the victor. And in fact, what's going to happen over the next few months in the course of 2025 will I hope, lead to negotiations. And that would have happened even if former Vice President Kamala Harris had been elected. Even though they didn't broadcast it, not just the Republicans, but the Democrats, I think, were looking forward to negotiations.
Well, that doesn't seem very likely. Putin is a savvy enough politician not to be sucked into a peace where it appears as if he's not the victor, is it?
No, it'll be very difficult to accomplish, but that's what statesmanship is all about: accomplishing what's really difficult. And you can't, leading into your question is that you can't have a peace without continued arming of Ukraine in order to, because that's the only thing that is going to bring Putin to the table.
Are you then, in a sense, nostalgic for a Cold War world where America carried a large stick and actually was willing to use it?
Well, the Cold War in Europe was a time of relative peace. It felt insecure, but it was a period of peace where the violence of the Cold War was confined to the edges, to southern Africa, to Vietnam, to Korea, to various other places, and to the Arab-Israeli wars, the great Arab-Israeli wars of the conventional Middle East. Europe itself, the western half of Europe that is prospered and did very well. It was the eastern half which was subjugated, under a kind of freeze frame poverty of Soviet domination.
The book, Robert, doesn't come with any images of a wasteland, but if you're opening your newspapers digitally or in analog form today, you'll see Gaza, which literally is a wasteland. It's been entirely destroyed by the Israeli army. You wrote an interesting piece in October of last year about Israel's new rules of war. Is it Israel and its behavior in Gaza and Syria, perhaps even in terms of a conflict with Iran? This is an area you know a lot about. Your last book was on the Middle East, the loom of time. Is Israel a manifestation of this? Is Netanyahu's policies, and perhaps even the figures to his right, are they a manifestation of a world in permanent crisis? Are they able to behave as they do literally decimating an entire region without any external controls?
Yes, it is a manifestation because the age of empire is over. The tragedy of the 20th century in the Middle East into the 21st is that nobody has come up with a solution to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was succeeded by British and French colonialism in the Levant, and then by American Soviet domination. And with all those empires gone, and America in less and less respected less and less over the last 2 decades, Middle Eastern countries are on their own. And I think that's where Netanyahu and Israel come in. They can't depend on America the way they used to. The trauma of October 7th, 2023, as I wrote, it may have been in that piece, has changed the Israeli calculus on what it has to do in the greater Middle East. But I think looking ahead, and I mentioned this in the book, is that the next real change in the Middle East, a sort of world historical change, will be some sort of collapse or transformation internally driven of the Iranian regime. Because, Iran is a country, as others have said, which is a country of South Koreans ruled by a clique of North Koreans. It's an extremely unpopular regime. It may be on its last legs. It's been terribly weakened by the Israelis in the past 6 months or so. And a change in the regime in Tehran, however it comes about, will change the Middle East.
One critique perhaps of your theory, Robert, is that America is as exceptional now as it's ever been. There was an interesting piece by my old friend Martin Wolf in the FT, their economics writer, about American economic prosperity. He, in one of the charts, it suggests that the US is exceptionally rich and becoming more so, and the gap in economic terms between the US and Europe and indeed the rest of the world is astonishing. I saw some numbers recently about investment in AI. I think globally, 80% of all the investment in AI is coming from Silicon Valley. Is there a connection between, if not the cultural or perhaps the military or political decline of the United States and its economic vitality? How does that play into your thesis about a world in permanent crisis?
Well, because as I said earlier, globalization has split the United States into 2 halves. And so you have incredible economic vitality on one hand, but you've had moderate and high levels of inflation on the other hand, which eat away much more at the standard of living of poorer people than of wealthier people. So you have a great wealth concentration, but you also have a lot of people suffering, and that's another thing that feeds into this political clash within the United States.
What becomes, you've mentioned that before, it seems increasingly that people who live where I live in San Francisco or on your coast, on the East Coast, have much more in common with people in London or Paris or even Beijing than they do in the hinterland. What becomes of the nation state, this 18th or perhaps 19th century political concept in the wasteland of the 21st century that you describe?
Well, yeah, the wasteland of the 21st century. The wasteland of Eliot's poem is about the dissolution of of societies, of countries, of fragmentation. And your question alludes to that very thing. When you have an elite that is more connected and more dependent upon elites on other continents, more professionally dependent, etc., on elites on other continents than on their own geographical space, continental geographical space, you get a weakening of the fiber of the nation itself. That's one of the things that fueled President Trump's reelection a few weeks ago.
There are people who are more optimistic. You seem rather bleak, Robert. I'm sure you're familiar with the work of George Friedman. He's been on the show a few years ago. He has a very interesting book out. It came out in 2020, The Storm Before the Calm, America's Discord, the Coming Crisis of the 20s and the Triumph Beyond. He actually places Trump in the old regime. What do you make of the thesis of guys like Friedman, who see the current chaos as necessary and inevitable before a new kind of calm, a new order comes into place?
Well, as I say at the end of the book, eventually everything I write will be superseded. All I can write is what I see now, what's happening now, and what's going to come over the next few years. You can be ahead of the curve in 5 and 10-year cycles, but not beyond, because the change in technology itself, makes anything like that pure speculation. George Friedman's idea is very compelling. I should say that I used to work for George Friedman. I have a lot of respect for him. But that's not the evidence that I see now. What I see is a United States that's increasingly divided, and which is mirrored in the divide of the political parties. I keep coming back to the theme that mass democracies require a political center, a center right, a center left, in order to produce good bills in Congress, in order to produce good government, in order to produce stability and peace in the society at large. And the center has been disappearing. And that leads to incoherence eventually.
One of the critiques of grand historians of theory of history like Spengler, who's central in your book, is it doesn't leave a lot of agency. These grand historical forces are somehow structural or inevitable. Maybe in a sense it comes out of that Hegelian or Marxist tradition in German thinking. In your thesis, Robert, of Wasteland, A World in Permanent Crisis, what can we do to make it a better world? Is this inevitable? Are you a grand historian of history? Do individuals control their own history in any way?
Of course, individuals do. From the very beginning of the book, talking about the Weimar Republic, where I talk about how someone like Heinrich Brüning, had he had political skills instead of just technocratic skills, could have meant that Hitler would have been avoided. History is all about maps and geopolitics until it all becomes about Shakespeare. Contingency, agency, etc. That was the theme of a previous book of mine, The Tragic Mind, about agency in Shakespeare, superseding geography and geopolitics. But keep in mind that agency can be negative too. You mentioned Mussolini earlier and others. That's agency too, but of a negative sort. So agency in and of itself does not necessarily lead to positive outcomes. What it does lead to is that history is contingent. And because none of us know the outcome in advance, we have no choice but to keep on struggling.
So who would be the equivalent of a Brüning in the 2020s? Would it be Joe Biden, Kamala Harris?
I'm not sure, because I see nobody in the 21st century at the level of Hitler or Stalin.
Is there a progressive alternative to all this, Robert? The left seems to be increasingly nostalgic. The right is dynamic, seems to be winning all the elections. Is one way to restore agency, to get beyond this wasteland, to come up with a progressive agenda that makes sense for the 21st rather than the 20th century?
Well, there is a progressive agenda, and it lost in the election, however close the election was. Um, I think a progressive agenda ultimately has to move towards the center. It can't penalize people because they don't belong to a preferred group or something or another. It has to appeal to people's self-interest.
Finally, Donald Rumsfeld, of course, always distinguished between known unknowns and unknown unknowns. What could change all this in the 21st century? Lots of focus on space, on extraterrestrial life. Is this the kind of unknown unknown that might shake us out of this slide into a wasteland?
Well, I
Because
don't
it
put
might bring the powers together, the Chinese, the Russians, the Americans, if there was, for example, a threat from some sort of extraterrestrial force.
Well, I don't put much store in extraterrestrials. But what I do put store into is that you can have great cataclysms that can bring people together and cause them to change. Remember, it was the rise of Hitler and Tojo in Japan that brought America out of the Great Depression. Without World War II, the Great Depression would have gone on significantly longer and would have, destabilized the society even more. So America has been lucky. There's often been an emergency that's caused it to rise to the occasion.
And what about the environment? Could that be the trigger that will bring everyone together? We, of course, had terrible, cataclysmic, almost apocalyptic fires in Los Angeles last week. Is this the thing that might convince the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans and maybe even the Europeans to start working together again?
No, I don't. Because I think the environment, in terms of the environmental crises that we've had so far, have been localized and are not enough to really affect grand geopolitics. I think that the fires in LA, however, could change California politics, but not world politics.
Well, Robert D. Kaplan, on January 20th, 2025, a lot of people are going to be very nervous about this new Trump administration. Some people will be celebrating. I think most people who watch this probably aren't great fans of Donald Trump. Do we have, finally, I want people to sleep well tonight, Robert, because you've made me and perhaps our audience miserable. Is there anything, even a glimmer of light in this dark world that you present?
Yes, there is. And it's how my book ends. It's about the rediscovery of liberalism in the classic sense, because the crowd, be it folk or mobs or anything, is about the destruction of the individual, the drowning out of the individual's voice. And what will get us through this period is a vibrant rediscovery of what liberalism ultimately means. And what liberalism ultimately means, a liberal is always in search. He's never sure that he's right. So it does not lead to dogmatism. I think liberalism, mass democracy can be destabilizing, but liberalism, however, has the ability to help us through this time.
Well, that is going to allow me to sleep, Robert D. Kaplan. Congratulations on the new book, Wasteland. It's out next week. It's a very, very important book, particularly for our complicated times, our times perhaps of permanent crisis. Congratulations on the new book. And it's always a pleasure and honor to have you on the show, Robert. We'll have to have you back on in the not too distant future. Keep
Thank
well,
you
keep
so
safe.
much, Andrew.